Clone Wars creator Dave Filoni gives a fascinating account of the light and dark sides of the Force and the need for balance in Star Wars. So Filoni basically says, ultimately, the Force is an ability that can be used selflessly or selfishly, and how one chooses to wield it determines whether you stand on the dark side or the light. The dark side of the Force is manifested in our greed, desire for power, and fears. And the light side of the Force is propagated by selfless action, by living in balance, by overcoming your fears. The Force naturally exists in balance. That balance is thrown out when someone chooses to give in to their fears and then spirals out of control, making selfish choice after selfish choice. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Our own ambitions can make the Force into something terrible, even when our intentions might have been good. We do not always realize we are acting out of fear or selfishness. Anakin believes that he's trying to save his wife and he's afraid to lose her. He chooses to act out of his fears and tries to control the situation. That moment of choice, how we act and react, is so important. The choice between dark and light are often subtle and not limited to the Jedi and Sith. Everyone struggles with the balance between light and dark. The Mandalorian has a choice to do his job, find the child, and hand him over to the Empire, or take this lost child in and protect it, becoming its guardian. It's a critical choice and one that greatly impacts both of their lives.
Interesting.
And that's pretty much what I've always kind of,
Well, I
you
think both
know,
of us have always basically said
yeah,
that. I mean,
said that, yeah. And
even
that's
and what instantly came to mind was our whole big light side versus dark side, which is another one that I will put in the comment section because it's very relevant to this. It's one of those things that I think that it's basically coming from Filoni, which is nice
mm-hmm,
because the Force is such an esoteric thing, and fans can debate it. We were debating it, and there was, of course, our perspective. And that perspective, even though he didn't go into as much detail as what we went into, it almost sounds like that what we were basically saying all along is what he's coming out and saying now. And so
mm-hmm.
I think that if we were able to ever have him on the show, oh, how cool would that be?
Oh,
That
man,
he would basically
be a
pretty
12-hour
much,
show.
yeah, yeah, right. I know we'd be asking him everything. No, just like a little bit more time, please. But it's one of those things that I honestly think that he pretty much would fall into line with everything that we were saying because in part what we were thinking was based on certain things that he had said in other interviews, and he's the one that spent all this time with George, and he really gets Star Wars, and I think that that's the reason why the Mandalorian is so good.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think, whenever we're talking about the Force, it's definitely one of those things that, um, and we've often said it, like, you have to have a little bit of dark and a little bit of light in you to kind of balance. Because I think if it's sometimes it's like when people tell you, you should be a nice person, but you can't be afraid to sometimes stand up for yourself or say no. And sometimes that's considered dark in some people's minds, or you're being mean, or, you're just being selfish. It's like, well, sometimes a little selfishness is good. It's just how you're being selfish, you know. And I think that's one of the things where, uh, Anakin was just trying to control too much. And that was his downfall, is that, okay, I want to try to prevent my wife from dying, but how do I do that without trying to, basically outdo the will of the Force? It's like he wouldn't allow the Force to have its will or have its way, and he was trying to control the Force in that manner, and that's what led him down that dark path.
Well, yeah, one of the
Um,
things that I loved about his explanation was, and again, it's gone back to something I've said a long time ago, that a lot of it is intent. A lot of it is the way that you use the Force. If you
mhm.
use it aggressively and selfishly, then, that is more of a dark side thing. And if you go a little bit more passively and a little bit more, um, I guess you could just say selflessly, just to encapsulate the whole thing. I mean, then then you're a little bit more toward the light. And then it's really when, and the thing that I thought was interesting about what he said is that it's really about more how a person or a group of people actually start to use it in a certain way that throws it off balance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where our whole thing was like, is almost like the rise of different groups or whatever, but it's almost like anybody could throw the force out of balance if it's
Yeah, I
strong
mean,
enough, you know?
definitely. It's kind of like the whole Spider-Man thing. You know, great power comes great responsibility, and you know, a lot of times we often say like, well, why didn't the Jedi just force choke him, or why didn't he just blow up his heart, or why didn't
Right.
he just, you know, it's like we always say that, but it's just like, you know, too much aggression sometimes will lead you down that path. So it's like, okay, is there another way I can? It's no different than like, you know, like I always, you know, mentioned the fact that, you know, being a martial artist, it's like, yeah, okay, someone won't let me do it. Fine, I could just take it by force.
Mm-hmm.
Who's stopping me? You know, but it's like, okay, do I realize even though a person is being a jerk towards me, I could give into that anger and it's like, you know what? I'm just beat the crap out of you. Or I could just say, you know what? All right, it's not that big of a deal. I'll walk away. And sometimes that decision, that split decision sometimes is the difference between how you're if you end up with an assault charge or if you get to go home at night to your family. You know what I mean? And that's how people, if you see it on the news in the real world, like that's how people are acting out of like split decisions. It's like, okay, somebody cuts you off on the road. Do I try to run them off the road and get in a confrontation with them? Or I just, you know what, turn on some peaceful music and just keep driving, thinking this, you know, hey, I got my life, my car's not damaged. Okay, that person's just a jerk. And that's their problem. And just keep moving. But that's hard for some people. So
Yeah, and the
keeping
other thing
yourself in
too
that
is that a
balance is
lot of
hard.
times, and it goes back to something else we said, I know during that conversation, is that, and this falls directly into Anakin's thing. Because if you look at the way Anakin felt versus the way, well, you can look at actually three different people. You have Palpatine, you have Dooku, you have Anakin.
Mm-hmm.
Palpatine was just pretty much purely selfish and evil from the get-go. You
Right.
know, he had evil intentions from the very beginning. The Force was a way for him to obtain what it was he was looking for, which is basically absolute power.
Mm-hmm.
There was no altruistic motive in that. There was nothing. He just wanted power over everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at on the other side of that, that whole good intentions pave the road to hell thing, it's like you have Anakin who started out with very noble intentions, who thought that ultimately the dark side of the Force would bring him the things that he wanted to do for others quicker. And then, of course, it blew up in his face as he realized immediately. And I thought that it was great that because that Rise of Vader, not the comic series, but the Rise of Darth Vader Legends book, did a great job in illustrating this, but then they did it again in Lords of the Sith, where they basically took that same concept. And then, of course, you have Dooku, who was disillusioned. There was a lot of things that the Jedi did that disillusioned him. So it wasn't like he was really trying to turn evil as much as he was just disillusioned with those he saw as good. And he could see that, you know, the seductive power of the dark side appealed to him. So you really have like three different people that were the dark side, falling to the dark side actually happened a little bit differently, but still
Sure.
threw the Force out of balance. And I
Yeah. I
mean,
mean,
the Snoke's explanation was great. You know, when darkness rises, light rises to meet it. I mean, to
mhm.
me, that's just that right there. That line perfectly sums up what the Force is doing. It's trying to keep itself into balance.
Right.
And you could even argue that when the Jedi were at their zenith, Palpatine rises up.
Mm-hmm.
What do we got? Ronaldo says Dave is consistent with the concept of the Force. Light side equals selflessness and dark side equals selfish. I mean, I guess
Right.
if you had to boil it down to, you know, very succinct, then yeah. You
Yeah,
can go ahead.
yeah. No, the biggest thing I would say with Anakin, and we often talk about Anakin. You know, he was trying to save Padme, and he was doing it for a selfless reason, and things like
Not
that.
really.
And I was about to say, and I was about to say, like, not really, because see, and I read something ironically today that kind of fits this. And George Lucas, we know that he's taken a lot of different elements from a lot of different forms of literature to craft and create Star Wars into its own.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he kind of took was, religion was from the Bible. And by no means am I, forcing religious or spiritual beliefs on anyone at this point in time, but this is something that I just saw today that just kind of hit me, just just in my own personal life. But then I started thinking about, like, ironically, Star Wars and Anakin, and like this is kind of exactly what happened to him. And this quote goes, um, when you want something out of the will of God, you have to stay outside of it to keep it. And that's basically what happened with Anakin, is that, see, had he not stepped out of the will or the rules of the Jedi Order and took a wife and formed that attachment to Padme, none of this would have happened. But
Exactly.
because he decided to be selfish and, like, I want what I want for me, now he was trying to do things to keep it. But in order to keep something that was not what he was supposed to have in the first place, he has to continue to keep finding these alternative means to keep what he should have never had to begin with. And
Right,
that's why,
and it's
even
true.
if you watch
Everybody
that up,
forgets that. And what I
yeah,
was going to even say, and it goes, I mean, it's perfectly in line. You just took it back a little further, but the point I was going to make was pretty much on that path that you were talking about, is that everybody talks about how he was doing it, but no, he was doing it for selfish reasons.
hmm
He wanted Padme. He didn't want her. He didn't want to lose her. It wasn't that he was doing it for her. He was doing it for him.
right,
And again, to even show his whole selfishness thing, even the comments that he made in Attack of the Clones, it's like, look, um, maybe there should be somebody that rules over everybody, so you don't have to worry about these committee type things.
hmm
It's kind of like somebody that knows best should rule over everybody else. And so you could see these seeds of, and she was like, well, who do you think? And he's like, no, not me necessarily. But,
hmm
and you could
somebody
see how,
wise,
right. But again, it's his passions. And that's the thing, passion. That's one of the things that lead to the dark side, is the fact that
hmm
if people could throw your compass off, a lot of these things could end up, and that's exactly what Palpatine did. He knew exactly how to get to Anakin,
hmm
get him through the selfish desires that he has, his passion for them, and then wrap it into a package of altruism and nobility. And you got him. Oh, okay,
yeah.
Ronaldo. Hang on,
hmm
let me get this one. As George Lucas said, in real life, selfish people are on the dark side and compassionate people are on the light side. The basic line of Star Wars is to have compassion for others. Yeah, I mean that's basically what it comes down to, really. Is the fact
Sure.
that it's a compassionate kind of a thing. And I guess if you really did have to um, factor in the Jedi, that's what it would be. And I think that that's part of what Yoda was saying too, when he was like, "Look, even the Jedi are starting to get a little arrogant, and this could cause some problems for us down the line."
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even when you look back at Anakin, like, which is why I understand why Yoda said he's too old to begin the training.
Mm-hmm.
It's because, like, at that point, he already formed an attachment to his mother.
Yep.
And so now that he lost his mother, he couldn't save his mother. There was that empty void that Padme eventually filled for him. And
Right.
then now he felt like, okay, well, now that my mother's gone, the only other woman in my life, or person that I feel close, like family, who basically he married, so that is family. And now that she's also expecting a child, so he thinks, not knowing that there's twins in there. Force is strong in his family.
Yeah, I guess they didn't have ultrasounds over there, and
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, aren't the medical droids like, letting you know, like, hey, you're gonna have two
Exactly.
kids? So much for preparation.
Maybe. So the thing is, I think that's why, Yoda, that's why they always go after the younglings, when they're babies, because they haven't formed an attachment to anything yet. And so now they can be molded solely just on the principles of the Jedi, as opposed to now you're trying to take somebody who's already formed an attachment to somebody. And now you, of course, you're naturally going to do the human thing, and that's you want to protect the ones that you love.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually can accept, like, there's certain things like in the military, that's why for a long time they didn't want women in the military for that reason. It was because they were afraid the men would form attachment to the women in the service.
Yep.
And that's the reason why they kind of was like, you know what, this is a guys only thing, because I'm going to protect you. Like if Eric, you and I were in the military, like, okay, I'm going to protect you as best as I can, because you're my companion and we're responsible for each other. But if you die, it's kind of like, well, we all signed up for the same thing. We knew the risk getting into this. But when you actually add an element where it's like, okay, someone who's considered quote unquote innocent to you, now it becomes like, okay, I have more of a duty, and it goes beyond the realm of like, okay, my service is like, now I have this
Well,
attachment
it's
to a
also like
person.
if you end up developing a romantic relationship with somebody
Mm-hmm.
in there, I mean,
Yep.
then that opens another whole door of attachment. So I mean, there's all these things that could lead to the attachment, and I think that that's one of the biggest downfalls, and that's why that was one of the things in the Jedi Order where a lot of times people thought, these guys are going a little bit too far, but they're not really looking at the consequences of what happens if that rule is not in place.
So do you feel like, so based upon this, all the stuff that we talked about, and Ronaldo weigh in on this as well. So Ahsoka took the life of pretty much living in the balance. She's like, I'm not neither light nor dark. Is that truly the better way? Because now you can have attachments in a way, or I think it's one of those things, like if you want to live the life of a Jedi, if you want to, for their purpose, I guess you almost have to not have attachments for that purpose.
I
But
would say so, because
if
it's
you're
really
trying
tough,
to,
man.
yeah, I mean, because it's kind of like, because like I love watching that episode of the Clone Wars where obviously, like, Obi-Wan had a close bond with Duchess Satine,
Mm-hmm.
and Anakin could see it. He knew what was up, but he realized Obi-Wan would never go full on into it. He would just kind of skirt the edges.
You talking about that whole
And
thing that eventually comes up in 7?
yeah, but it's like when they were dealing with the issues on Mandalore.
Mm.
And remember, she kept calling for, like, at first she was like, Obi-Wan, I'll never want to see you again, blah blah blah. And he was just like, you could tell Obi-Wan was kind of heartbroken by it, but he was like, okay, well, I respect your wishes. But then at the same time, when she got in trouble, who did she call? Obi-Wan.
Mm-hmm.
And of
Yep.
course, Obi-Wan felt that sense of like, because he had feelings for her, he would go even outside of the Jedi Council. He would even like, well, I'm just taking this side trip, and no one really has to know about it. And Anakin understood that, because Anakin's like, oh, you're finally dipping into my world now. And so Anakin was like, all right, I got you, because I understand that line of thinking and those emotions. But he also noticed that, like, Obi-Wan would never go all the way in, because Anakin was like, well, why don't you just tell her how you feel? And he's just like, I can't, because that's a violation, and that's that causes too much,
Well, that's what I thought was a stroke of genius when they did season 7, is that came back to bite him, because Anakin basically called him out for that, if you remember.
mm-hmm.
He was like, she ended up dying or whatever, and, they didn't have to, and, it's all because you turned your back on her, and, and all this stuff. And you can actually, the stroke of genius of it is, because this is overlapping with Revenge of the Sith, you could see that this is another thing that we didn't see in the movie that's
Mm-hmm.
actually causing Anakin to go, you know what? I don't know if I really like the Jedi way. I don't know if I really think that this is a good thing.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the things that it kind of sucks to be, because on one hand, and if you look at the Jedi in a way, they're kind of selfish too. Because one, if you really look at it, they are acquiring these younglings at, and they're basically ripping them from their family to live this life as a Jedi, or like a monk almost. And so they're depriving these children of knowing their actual parents and having that relationship. They're depriving them from having any future romantic relationships. And they're not giving these kids a choice. And if this is the life that they want to live, they're just saying, this is the, almost like, this is the way, you know?
Well, part of it is and this is the problem, is that, oh, they're force sensitive. If we don't get a hold of them, they could go to
The
the
Sith
dark
way.
side. So
Yeah.
we have to do it.
Right. And exactly. So it's like, it's not even so much like this is for the betterment of this child's life. It's more so like, okay, well, we want to protect the galaxy from the potential evil that could happen if these kids, tap into these powers and they start, going into the dark side. All this anarchy could come up. So there's a whole ideology system that really needs to be revamped. And I that's why I love the whole thing with Luke in Last Jedi, when he was basically talking about, the Jedi were just a series of failures. If you really look at it,
Yeah, I mean,
because
honestly, I think it was great that Luke basically chronicled the whole thing, and that's why I think that, now we don't know how early this goes back, but I think that that's why Luke was going to go, I'm going to try to do a little bit of a different spin on the Jedi Order. Now, we know that that's happening by the time, say, Kylo was in it. Well, I should say Ben. But we don't know if that was what Luke was doing right from the beginning. Like, it could be that maybe right after Return of the Jedi, he goes, hey, I'm going to reform the Jedi Order, like, right down to the book, like, I'm letter perfect. And then maybe 15 years in, he's kind of like, this isn't quite as cool as I expected it to be. And then, oh, look, I'm looking through Jedi history, and they're not really doing all that well in certain areas. So I'm going to have to, change my whole thinking or whatever. So that could very well be.
Ronaldo says that's why Qui-Gon Jinn didn't follow the code, because he believed the Jedi could love, but the Jedi thought that loving was the same as attachment and selfishness.
Yeah, I mean, that's really where you get this, pardon the pun, gray area. Because you did have people that were like Qui-Gon, and there was a few others that were
Quinlan
more
Voss.
like, yeah, Quinlan Voss. They were a little bit like, they weren't quite the gray Jedi, really, although you could say they were the precursors of what we would call gray Jedi, but they were more like modifiers of the Jedi Order. They pretty much lived as Jedi, but they tried to right some of the wrongs that, and some of the extreme dogma that could get them into trouble. And this is what Obi-Wan learned to do. If you actually look at Obi-Wan's growth, which I think is another cool thing, because other than Ahsoka, Obi-Wan is the only other probably like character. I mean, I guess you could say Anakin too, because we see Anakin at 9 all the way up through, I think he's like in his 40s or 50s or something when he's Vader. But essentially, what you end up seeing is that you have Obi-Wan, who's very much by the book when he's a Padawan. He's hypercritical of Qui-Gon and his way of doing things. He's just, you know what? You're just if you just weren't the way you are, you'd be like a master on the council, you'd be this, you'd be that, but you're constantly doing all this stuff. He goes from that, and then you look at him as he's much older, and you can even tell, like all through Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, everything else, Anakin had a positive effect on him.
Mm-hmm.
He basically was like, you know what, we can... And he kind of loosened up a little bit, and I think he was a better Jedi for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ronaldo says perhaps the best the Jedi could have done is to teach the Padawans not to deny anger or their loving feelings, but not to let them control them. Exactly. I think you hit the nail right on the head, Ronaldo. I think that's the better option. It's just that, you have to teach them how to control it. The problem with it is that the Jedi just didn't trust them enough to do it. So they figured they just strip it from them completely. But I completely agree with you. I think that's the better thing. And it's no different than, like I said, going using the martial arts thing, we're taught to, be peaceful, treat people with respect, only use your art when necessary in the defense of yourself or others who can't defend for themselves. Those are the things that we're taught. But, there's things that are, they say, yeah, you're going to get angry sometimes. That's a natural human emotion to be angry, and you should feel that. However, you should never let it control you. You should never act out of rage. So if you have to defend yourself, you should defend yourself from a state. And that's what the Jedi was more about, like even looking at their fighting styles, which is why Obi-Wan took the Sorensu style approach of lightsaber combat, where his was more defensive, where it's like, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to defend you. And hopefully you tire yourself out, or you put yourself in a position where the defense becomes the offense. Whereas Anakin was more like, no, you come at me, I'm going after you, and that's a little bit more the aggressive side of things. So I think you make a very, very valid point, Ronaldo. And I completely concur, is that, I think it's more so embracing your feelings, understanding your feelings so you can learn how to control them. The problem is the Jedi just didn't trust people to actually do that.
Yep. And that's basically what it comes down to. So again, there's a lot to digest for everybody, but what do you guys think when it comes to the nature of the Force? Do you think that the balance, obviously it's hard to argue with Filoni.
Right.
But, you guys have been listening to this conversation. What do you think? Do you think that the Jedi way truly was the best way? Or do you think that maybe they should have loosened up a little bit and been a little bit more in the center? Because sometimes you can achieve balance by going to somewhat of an extreme if you're balancing it out, right? Because, if the dark is kind of like way up here, then, sometimes you have to, in order to meet it, you gotta bend a little rules. You gotta do some stuff. So,
right.
What do you guys ultimately think would be the best path of the Jedi? Let us know in the comments section below.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.